Everyone told Elias the girl was boring and quiet. But at a forced dinner party, when that same boring girl finally spoke up, the entire restaurant fell completely silent. What exactly did she say? Julian made his pitch while we were still trapped in evening traffic. He framed it as a favor. Clara was a force of nature, he insisted, the kind of person who could make a brick wall feel heard. Her sister, Nora, on the other hand, was an acquired taste. He used the word analytical like it was a medical diagnosis. I stared at the taillights bleeding red across the wet windshield and let him talk. I already knew Julian's compass for human behavior was terribly skewed. If he thought someone was boring, they usually just had a low tolerance for his nonsense. We arrived at the tapas place 20 minutes late. The reservation was for 6. Julian and his new fiancée, 2 colleagues I immediately forgot the names of, and the sisters. Clara took the seat on my left. She practically hummed with kinetic energy, instantly deploying a warm, practiced smile that swept the table. Nora sat directly across from me. She offered a brief nod, then lowered her eyes to study the drink list with the severe intensity of a bomb technician defusing a wire. Julian had given me my marching orders before we stepped out of the car. "Just keep Nora occupied," he had pleaded. "She barely goes out. Just don't let her kill the mood." The first half hour belonged entirely to Clara. I watched her work the table. She had a rare, terrifying charisma, the kind of effortless charm that makes everyone at the table feel like they are the most fascinating person in the room. I recognized it as a highly refined skill, a survival mechanism for navigating a loud world. Nora ordered a glass of dry red wine and retreated into silence. Then Julian, attempting to weave me into the grand tapestry of the evening, decided to bring up my career. I restore historical spaces, specifically private chapels and old solariums. Julian spun this into a clumsy punchline about me dealing exclusively with ghosts and dust, implying I was far too nostalgic for the modern world. The table offered a polite collective chuckle. That was when Nora finally looked up. She bypassed Julian entirely, fixing her gaze squarely on me. She did not raise her voice to command the room, but spoke with a quiet density that demanded attention anyway. "When was the last time you restored a space where someone actually felt safe falling apart?" The clinking of silverware stopped. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to drop an octave. Everyone froze, recalibrating the casual atmosphere. I stared across the table. Nora held my gaze. Her eyes were dark and steady, entirely devoid of the polite panic people usually project when they've made a conversation awkward. She rested her fingers against the stem of her wine glass, perfectly willing to let the silence stretch until I gave her a real answer. "A conservatory," I said, my voice matching her low volume. "A father hired me after his son passed away. He needed a room where the rain sounded louder than his own thoughts." She held my eyes for a second longer, processing the weight of the words. Then she gave a single definitive nod. "That is a good answer." And just like that, she released the tension. The group exhaled. Clara launched into a bright anecdote about a rogue squirrel in her apartment, and the evening's rhythm returned. I spent the remainder of the meal completely derailed. "My name is Elias Thorne. I am 38. I spend my days pulling rot out of old wood and convincing clients not to paint over history. My business relies entirely on word of mouth, which leaves me constantly hovering on the edge of financial anxiety. I live in a drafty loft filled with architectural salvage. I had been single for 2 years. My single status wasn't a tragedy, just a byproduct of exhaustion and inertia. But to people like Julian, a solitary existence was an equation crying out to be solved with forced socializing. Clara and Nora were 30. I only knew this because Julian had complained that Nora acted like a retired librarian, which translated to Nora didn't laugh at Julian's jokes. She worked as an archival linguist, translating dialects that were on the brink of extinction. Julian had butchered the description, calling it something about old dictionaries. She had sharp, angular features and dark hair tied back severely, save for a few strands that escaped to frame her jaw. She wore a heavy, oxidized copper ring on her index finger, twisting it slowly when she observed the room. Clara was undeniably magnetic, glowing with warmth, but she wasn't the one pulling my gravity across the table. After dinner, Julian dragged us to a crowded cocktail bar down the street. It was an obligation masked as leisure. The group fractured on the pavement, and I found myself falling into step beside Nora. We walked a full block in total silence before she finally spoke. "You gave me the polite version," she said, looking straight ahead. "You didn't answer the question." I stopped walking. She stopped too, turning to face me under the harsh orange glare of a street lamp. "You told me what you built. I asked about the space." I considered her. She wasn't being difficult. She was demanding precision. He needed the glass panels angled specifically so he couldn't see his own reflection at night. He couldn't stand looking at a face that had outlived his child. I built it so the outside world came in, but his reflections stayed out. It was a space designed to hide him from himself. Nora exhaled quietly. "There, that is the proper answer." I felt a sudden spike of frustration. "You could have pointed that out at the restaurant." She gave me a look that suggested I was missing the obvious, turned and walked into the bar. I had no defense against that. The rest of the night was a blur of loud music and spilled drinks. I made the expected small talk. I laughed at the right cues. All the while, I tracked Nora's position in the room with the covert hyper-awareness of someone trying desperately to pretend they aren't paying attention. She vanished at midnight, without a grand exit. She hugged Clara briefly, a gesture loaded with a private, unspoken sibling language, then found me near the coat check. "Good night, Elias," she said, using a tone that made the simple farewell sound like a binding contract, and walked out. Julian materialized instantly, clapping my shoulder. "Told you, total buzzkill, right? But Clara's a riot." I muttered in agreement, just to make him go away. For 4 days, the question haunted me. It wasn't the answer that kept me awake. It was the raw, unpolished nature of the asking. She didn't ask it to sound profound. She asked because she despised surface-level static. When you told her what you did, she didn't fish for a compliment to return. She dug for the skeleton underneath. By Tuesday night, I was sitting on my floor eating cold leftovers, hunting down her academic work. I bypassed Julian entirely and searched the university database. I found a paper she wrote on the syntax of a dying coastal dialect. I barely grasped the linguistics, but I read every page. In the margins of her acknowledgement section, she had written, "To the committee who warned me this translation was too niche to matter, it mattered to the people who spoke it." I spent 48 hours turning that sentence over in my mind. On Thursday, I finally texted Julian. I asked for Nora's number, framing it as casually as I could. He responded immediately with a barrage of shocked emojis in a contact card. I stared at the digits until my phone screen timed out. Working with old structures teaches you that hasty dismantling destroys the foundation. I took my time. At 8 that evening, I sent a message. "This is Elias from the tapas place. You were right about my answer at the table. I'd like to give you the unedited version." The reply came back a torturous half hour later. I was wondering how long it would take you. Friday, 6 o'clock, a bookstore cafe on Mercer Street. They ban laptops and don't play music. I smiled at the screen. How did you know I hate loud cafes? Her response was immediate this time. You spent the entire night at the bar inching toward the emergency exit. Friday. The bookstore smelled of dust and old paper. The cafe in the back was entirely silent. Nora was sitting in a corner booth, nursing black tea. She looked at me with that same expectant, unblinking focus. I realized, with a profound sense of relief, that I was completely out of my depth. I sat down and told her the whole story about the grieving father. I told her about the blueprints, the way I sourced antique timber to match the original house, and the afternoon I found the man asleep in the finished room, finally resting after months of insomnia. I had never shared the mechanics of my grief work with anyone. It always felt too heavy for casual consumption. Nora didn't interrupt. She slowly rotated the copper ring on her finger. When I finally stopped talking, the silence stretched comfortably. You don't just fix buildings, she said quietly. You build emotional armor. I nodded. I try. She took a sip of her tea. That is why I asked. Julian made your work sound like an eccentric hobby. I needed to know if you believed his version of you, or if you actually knew what you were doing. I leaned forward. And what did you conclude? I concluded that I would meet you on Friday. I have an absolute weakness for women who refuse to waste vocabulary. We stayed until the barista swept the floors around us, ignoring the subtle hints to leave. She explained her linguistic research, not with flashy academic jargon, but with the quiet conviction of someone preserving ghosts. She possessed a stillness that fascinated me, a complete cessation of physical movement when she was absorbing information. When we finally stepped out onto the damp pavement of Mercer Street, she stopped and faced me. You are probably trying to figure out how to ask if I am romantically involved with anyone. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets. Was my maneuvering that transparent? No, she said evenly. You were extremely careful, which is exactly how I knew. I am not seeing anyone, but I need to be clear. I am difficult in specific ways. I abhor small talk. I ask intrusive questions. I will abandon a crowded room without warning. I watched you endure 2 of those 3 traits on Saturday. She tilted her head. And yet you are standing here. I held her gaze, feeling the sharp winter air between us. I am standing here. She evaluated my face, searching for hesitation. Finding none, she gave that sharp, decisive nod. Good. Next week, same time. She turned and walked toward the subway. I watched her disappear, intensely grateful that she had taken the wheel. Nora possessed a rare, terrifying memory. Over the next 2 months, I learned what it meant to be truly observed. She recalled offhand comments I made weeks prior. She sent me articles on medieval architecture without any accompanying text, trusting I understood the implication. I saw this and thought of you. Her text messages were deliberate and sparse. She never performed for my benefit. She was ruthlessly, beautifully herself at all times. It made every space she occupied mold to her presence. 7 weeks in, she visited the abandoned chapel I was restoring in the warehouse district. She sat on a tarp-covered pew while I sanded the altar rail, reading a dense paperback. The afternoon bled into evening. The only sounds the scrape of sandpaper and the turning of pages. Eventually, she closed the book. This space has good bones. I wiped sweat from my forehead. The roof leaks. She looked at me, stripping away the casual banter. That isn't what I meant. I know, I said softly. She placed the book down. I went to that dinner solely because Clara begged me to. I despise forced setups. She touched the copper ring. But I noticed you weren't following Julian's script. You were observing the room, she continued, her voice echoing faintly in the cavernous chapel. I notice things people try to hide. I put down my tools. I walked over, stepping carefully over the drop cloths, and crouched in front of her. I drove home that night and obsessed over a single question. I dug up your thesis in the middle of the night. I had been moving cautiously because I was terrified of misreading you. Nora reached out, her fingers brushing the sawdust from my shirt collar. You didn't misread anything. I just operate on a different timeline. I caught her hand, my thumb resting against the cold copper of her ring. I have nowhere else to be. She finally smiled. It wasn't the polite mask people wear in public. It was genuine, hard-won, and entirely mine. We sat in the dusty quiet, surrounded by centuries-old timber, anchored by the profound relief of being understood. Half an hour later, Clara banged on the heavy chapel doors to drop off Nora's forgotten keys. She took one look at our intertwined hands and grinned with unbearable smugness. Years later, whenever people asked how we met, Clara would spin a ridiculous narrative about blind dates and opposites attracting. Nora would let her finish, then look at me and say, he knew the real answer. And for us, that was the only truth that mattered.